About half of the men and women on death row are minorities. Nearly 40% of those executed since 1976 have been black, even though they only make up 12% of the population. What factors lead to this disparity? And can those factors be addressed without eliminating the death penalty? Or is this final punishment fundamentally unfair? We examine race, fairness, and capital punishment today on The Professors.
From across the city and the 7 city colleges of Chicago, broadcasting from 63rd and Halsted at Kennedy King College. Professors take the art of conversation to a higher degree.
I'm C.M. Winters Palacio. Joining me today are special guests Glenn Reedus, editor at the Chicago Crusader, and professors Lou Myers from Kennedy King College and Ted Williams, also from Kennedy King College. But before we begin this conversation, here's a student-produced piece on the public's view on race and the death penalty.
We've seen time and time again through the judicial system that the value of a black life is much, much, much less than the value of a white life.
African Americans' lives are considered much less worthy of living than a white person's life. But those prejudices have been going on for over 200 years.
Black lives haven't been given the same amount of value, as a lot of other races.
In 82% of death penalty cases, those who murdered whites were more likely to be sentenced to death than those who murdered blacks. That's according to a report issued by the Government Accounting Office. One person not surprised by those findings is Kennedy King professor and criminal defense attorney Louis Myers, Jr.
The system of criminal justice in this country has historically been racially tainted.
Myers, who has been practicing law for nearly 40 years, says the racial disparity in death penalty cases was even worse in the 1970s.
More blacks, were more likely to get the death penalty than whites. More blacks, particularly if the victim in the crime was white, was more likely to be sentenced to death.
According to Professor Myers, the solution to racial disparity is to eliminate the death penalty, which he believes will disappear in 5 to 10 years.
We've developed so much, we've been exposed to different cultures, different philosophies, but as far as disparity in terms of how different races are treated, there are still certain ones that are favored as opposed to others, and that bleeds into our legal system.
Things aren't as equal as we thought they were. But in the same instance, we're progressing, so hopefully 30 years from now, they will have changed.
Reporting for the professors on WYCC, I'm Erica Holcomb.
All right, so gentlemen, the death penalty. I'll have to be honest, as aware that I am socially, I like to think that I am. I really did not begin to pay as much close attention to the intricate details of the death penalty until the incident of Troy Davis. Do you think that that's pretty much the same generalization? It was because of the spread of awareness of Troy Davis incident?
I think that the Troy Davis case, people in our culture attach themselves to stories. So you can provide statistics and information, but when you see a real story, and when you see people who came out in support of Troy Davis from all different spectrums of America, from wealthy to poor to different races, that sort of thing, it really got people to think, and I think it has heightened public awareness to a place where we can begin to move. Now, we were talking about this earlier, and Professor Myers was saying that there's always sort of a case like this that comes up, but I think that's a good thing, because we need to constantly be made aware of the disparities that exist in the death penalty.
Let me ask you this, Glenn, and especially Lou, do you think, because there are others who say that Troy Davis really wasn't the innocent victim as he had been portrayed in the media, per se, okay? But do you think that, regardless of that, do you think that kind of takes away from the value of the importance of the conversation?
No, let me go back. It might be a historical anachronism to think that the real public worldwide outrage about the death penalty started with Troy Davis. That's not true. I actually, I'm sure I look younger, but I tried my first death penalty case around 1978 or 79, to be very honest with you. And that case was tried in Mississippi, believe it or not, with an all-white jury. And so I've been involved in litigation as well as a avid anti-capital punishment person. There have been a number of cases between 1976 and up to Troy Davis where there has been worldwide attention about the death penalty. That was a case down in Texas about 5 or 6 years ago. Reverend Jackson, Al Sharpton, they actually went down to Huntsville, which is where this guy was executed, and witnessed that. That was worldwide. CNN put that around the world. I am familiar with maybe 10 or 15 cases that over the years, particularly in the last 20 years, that have received the notoriety of Troy Davis. Troy Davis really becomes a phenomenon only because of this generation. So when you talk about the death penalty, you talk about, well, I didn't know this, but you didn't know it because in your generation, maybe you didn't experience some of the other ones, but there's been a continuity of these types of cases where people have expressed outrage and have raised the question, not just about the unconstitutionality of the death penalty, wherever wherever it's found, but the whole wrongness of it. This is a moral issue as well as it is a legal issue. Sure. And I don't want anybody to be confused about my position. Let's assume that all of the people on death row were white. I would still oppose the death penalty. If they were all black, I would still oppose the death penalty, because there's a philosophical issue here that goes to the heart of it. It is wrong to take a life. I believe everybody, and like Ted and I'm sure agree, everybody can be redeemed, and I believe in salvation, and I believe that if Jesus told a man on the cross as he was dying that with you can be with me no matter what you've done in life, that's the ultimate. Remember, Jesus Christ was executed, and it was capital punishment that put him on the cross.
Yeah. That's a very good point. That's a very good point. I want to also talk about then, I understand that there is the moral argument. Let's talk about the disparity and the history of that disparity. I mean, I always say it doesn't take all day to recognize sunshine. And it is very clear that there's a huge disproportion between whites and non-whites who are on death row. Glenn, would you like to speak to that?
Sure. I think that starts, though, at the earliest point possible with the arrest and then what the individual is charged with. We know that a white person can do something identical in terms of breaking the law, but the charge will not be as harsh as for the black person doing the same thing. And that starts with the cops and just works its way up the system, which in turn can result in a sentencing of death.
And I would say that not just the issue of who's on death row, but really where the disparity is seen is who the victims are. And so in 76% of death penalty cases, the victims are white. And what we see is that there is a premium or higher level of value placed on certain people's lives in our culture. I mean, it's a sad tragedy. And so it's not just the issue of who's getting the death penalty, but it really is an issue of who the victims are and what kinds of cases cause us to go after the death penalty.
Race has aggravated.
Okay.
Let's understand where we are now. This is the United States of America, really depending on who you talk to, founded in 1619 or however, but there's a history. This country was founded on race and class. Race has been a systemic part of the American sad dilemma when it comes to humanity, for a number of years. But let's go back just for a moment. Race shapes, forms, who goes where, and who gets the death penalty. But at the end of the day, we have to keep ourselves focused on the death penalty as a means of punishment. And I'm going to reiterate this. In and of itself, race is an aggravating factor which is reflective of the American history of discrimination, of Jim Crow, right, of racial apartheid. You know, that goes with America. You know, we have to own up to that. But all said and done, if everything was evil, or equal, pardon me, if everything was equal and evil, right? Right. If everything was equal, it should still be opposed. Yeah. Man and woman, humankind should be able to resolve differences without murder.
Especially given the constitutional protections against cruel and unusual punishment. I mean, there's nothing sort of more blatantly on its face, a conflict, if you will, that we have protected American citizens against the notion of cruel and unusual punishment. I don't know what is more cruel and unusual than executing someone. Now, we realize that for many years, the electric chair was the major way that people were executed. Now, for the sake of trying to kind of fall under those constitutional protections, we have predominantly used lethal injection going forward. But many people even question whether lethal injection, given that you have 3 different shots, you know, one to paralyze you, one to stop your heart, one to numb you, whether people in that process are still sort of feeling pain and they can't tell the people that they're feeling pain because they've been paralyzed, but their heart is being stopped. And so there are still these constitutional questions, and like Professor Meyer says, it's not just a race issue. These are constitutional questions that, for instance, the Europeans, whose issue has been race historically, but they're not dealing with the same challenge, they got rid of the death penalty for a lot of these other reasons as well.
I think we ought to make a point here. And I think the American public should hear this over and over again. The majority of the nations in the world, with the exception of maybe 5 in the world, including South Africa, has abolished the death penalty.
That's huge.
You know, this is a phenomenon that is almost systemic to the socio-psychic drama and the history of this country. So if everybody in the world has decided that the death penalty, you know, is repugnant and violates notions of fundamental fairness and humanity, then where are we now?
And the sad thing
about that. Let me ask you, Glenn, what about that? Why is the U.S. so resistant, in your opinion?
With everything, the U.S. is supposed to be right. I mean, when you look at the George Bush and going into Iraq, how many years had those people had their religions? Their country was thousands of years older than the U.S., but we see fit to try to implement democracy and Christianity there. We look historically as when another country does something that's counter to what is the norm here, they're wrong. We're never wrong.
So you think it's an issue of the U.S. policy being self-righteous?
No, I think it is an issue of hypocrisy. Okay, you know, you're preaching 2 different stories. It's like the Constitution, and people went to Philadelphia in 1775, 1776, wrote the Constitution. It was preceded by the Declaration of Independence, which started off by saying all men are created equal. As at that point, 3 million slaves were running around America, you know, not considered to be citizens, but considered to be property. You know, the hypocrisy of this country in its self-righteousness to other people in the world of being the power, you know, that sets the moral goals and standards for the world, and then on the other side of the dime, you know, engaging itself in those things that are directly opposed to all of what they claim to be. This is America's hypocrisy. It's up to citizens in this country to organize, mobilize, educate, come together, and force the hypocrisy to become a different reality.
And the states are doing that, which is sort of the amazing federalism issue that's happening right here. Right. So in most civil rights cases, it's the federal government that has had to step in and stop the states from violating people's civil rights. In this case, it's really the exact opposite. There are 17 states that have outlawed the death penalty now, most recently our state. And what's happening is the movement is on the ground. The states are saying, hey, we don't want it sort of one by one, and the federal government has yet to follow. Now, interestingly enough, with the exception of Texas, most states don't really even use it all that much. Texas literally has 4 times the number of executions since 1976.
Well, let's talk about Texas. Why is Texas using it so much? Is it because Texas is a racist state? Why is Texas using it so much?
It's a culture, I think.
It's a culture?
It's a culture.
Yeah, well,
You're from
I guess,
Texas. You could speak
yeah,
better than all of us.
man, I knew you were going to do that, right?
Yeah.
Why don't you speak right up?
You know, I've only been there. He's from
No,
there.
let
so
me just
him
say,
talk
I
about
think it's more of the culture and
A
of the
culture
state.
of racism?
Yeah, but you see, I don't want to just.
Barbarity,
I just don't want to put it all on Texas.
Yeah.
You know, you got Texas, you got Florida, you got about 4 other states.
Virginia, but Texas is by far the
By
leader
far
in that way.
more consistent, you know, monthly executions and all of that.
Well, let me ask you, does Texas have the lowest crime rates?
No.
Absolutely
So see,
not.
it's not working.
Absolutely
It's not
not.
working.
Well, the death penalty is not working anywhere. I'm glad that you allowed me to segue into that. You know, let's deal with the realities of it. People, you know, say, I'm for the death penalty. And most people who say, well, my cousin was killed yesterday. My son was shot. And it becomes a highly emotional issue. But there is no statistical survey. There is no validated information that shows that the executions and capital punishment is a deterrent to crime.
Right.
People who go kill each other, let's just take Chicago. When people kill each other in Chicago, nobody says, Bob, let's take a moment. You know, I might get the death penalty. Because murders don't happen like that. The death penalty is not out there. I'm not going to kill these 3 people because I'm going to be executed. It does not play that way. It has no correlation to deterrence of crime. So if we should take that off of the table, then what's left? Revenge and vengefulness.
That's it.
Because people want to be satisfied in their own psychic, emotional dilemmas.
And it's
that
funny-
something will be done about what happened to me.
And it's funny you should bring up vengeance because right as we were preparing for the show, a colleague of me asked, so are you for the death penalty? I said, no. So you mean to tell me if someone came in and killed your child, you would not be for the death penalty? I said, I'm not for the death penalty because the death is not coming from the hands of the victim. If the death was coming from the hand of the victim or the victim's family, I think I would probably be more for the death penalty. But it's really not. But I want to switch gears here now. Let's start talking about the death penalty in Illinois, which of course we know it has been abolished. I want to know this. Do you think, especially Glenn, do you think that Ryan committed political suicide by taking that stand for the death penalty?
For a lifetime. I mean, if he were 30 years old when he did that, and he lived to be 80, 90, he'd never hold an office above a local level again. And I think that was huge. It speaks volumes about the man's soul, about his heart, and how he sees his fellow man. But of course, it took some innocent people being killed, because they were exonerated later through DNA. It took that for him to see the light. And it's a mystery to me why other governors, with the exception of Texas, can't see that same light. I mean, every 3 weeks now, we're finding that somebody who has been in prison for years, the DNA shows they didn't actually do the crime.
Exactly.
Look, what Ryan did, whether it was political suicide or not, you got to give him credit. I don't believe it was all politics, quite frankly. I think that after having looked at everything that he saw and having been bombarded with some of the gross inequities in sentencing and having become aware that there were innocent men and women on death row, I actually met somebody who was on the Illinois death row, and they were 48 hours from being killed. They had actually measured the man for the coffin. You know, after they kill you with lethal injection, then they come and take you away. He had been measured, and less than 48 hours before they shot him up, he had a stay of his execution, and after that it was found that he was innocent. I actually met him, I actually talked to him, 48 hours away from death. Governor Ryan, and saw things. That's just one case.
Yeah.
But there were multiple cases where in the state of Illinois, due to racism, prosecutorial misconduct, due to flaws in the system, that had resulted in innocent human beings being placed on death row. Yeah. The governor then said, wait a minute, I can't take a risk. Some of these folk might deserve to be here by the law, but at the end of the day, when you're rolling the dice and you don't know who is or who ain't, who did it and who didn't do it, he, I believe, said morally, I cannot corroborate or cooperate with doing that.
And here's the reality, and this is the argument that's made, and I do understand it. Let me say this. The other side would make the argument that for the most heinous crimes, I mean, we had this crime just recently in the suburbs where the gentleman broke into this family's house and the young girl came home and,
He is a far
right,
cry from a gentleman.
right, okay, well, yeah, and then, you
were
you
being
had
kind.
you had the case of the grandmother. I mean, there's just so many cases, unfortunately, in our society, in our city. I understand the desire in many ways for vengeance. I understand, I get it. I mean, I've not been in that situation, thank God. But the reality is we have to really ask ourselves the question, as a society, what are we accomplishing? And does a life without the possibility of parole, does it serve the same function? I have read of many cases where there have been convicted killers who've actually would prefer to have death than to spend their lives in a 4x6 cell. And so I just am very concerned that while everything that he's saying, it's very real, what are we really accomplishing?
Well, let me just say
made
this.
it a one-size-fit-all, though. That's the problem. The two cases that you mentioned, I think it'd be very difficult to find people who would disagree with you, given those circumstances.
Well, let me give you three cases. Since I know we're coming to an end here. What would you think if a man had been indicted by an American grand jury and he was wanted, right? What would you think if somebody said, you know what, we're not going to even give him a trial. Wherever you find him, we're just going to murder him. No due process, right? No Eighth Amendment cruel and unusual punishment. And so one day you find him and you go in and he has his hands up in a room and he's shot and killed and dumped in an ocean 48 hours later. Let's try another one. What if, since all of us are talking about the death penalty, what if an American citizen, first guy wasn't an American citizen, what if two American citizens are in a car and a man in the White House or somebody's house decides that these two guys don't deserve a trial. They don't deserve to be brought to justice. They don't deserve to be given a lawyer. They don't warrant any of that. So one day, what do? We drop a bomb, a drone, and we kill them. Now, part of the psychopathy, I think, at times of the death penalty, and I'm using that term, right, of people who really believe in that, part of that is that they are unremorseful. We can kill. The same phenomenon. They can go out and kill people without trials, without due process.
Yeah.
At some point, where does civilization, humanity comes together just based on natural law, based on what is right, how human beings should treat each other, and say there has to be a line, and killing people has to be where the line is drawn, and the line has to be if all of the world, with the exception of maybe 5 countries, have abolished it. That means almost 190 countries have abolished in the world the death penalty. Then when do we come into the world of humanity and do something different?
And most of those countries we consider to be barbaric. Anyway.
Absolutely.
We do,
Well,
Absolutely.
I'll accept
different.
Lou's remarks as leading into our final comments. So, Glenn, what are your final remarks?
If we could jump back to Texas and talk about that sort of culture, why that happens, it's a very political thing, and not to minimize the death penalty at all, but when you look at Illinois and you look at, I don't know how many, 6, 7, 8 governors who have ignored taking state money intended for the pension fund and spending it for other things. So when you look at Texas And you've got Governor A through Governor H all saying, well, yeah, this guy, he killed some people. I'm gonna do it too. I mean, that's what the people want. But they aren't asking the people if that's what they want. So when you set up that kind of linear thinking about the death penalty, I mean, it's pretty clear why they leave the country and why some place like New Hampshire or Rhode Island, despite the difference in population, we never hear about them.
And Ted, what are your final remarks?
I just think that as a nation, I think that Professor Meyer's point about international and foreign policy is very valid, whether it was made directly. Let's make it directly. We do this very clearly as a foreign policy consistent United States. We just had two major executions, if you will, of people that that most Americans were not, you did not have a favorable opinion of, but you would make the case, do they deserve some level of due process? And so I think that, and many people have argued this, that the death penalty makes us barbaric, and that in the end, that we lose out. I think it was Gandhi who said, an eye for an eye makes us all blind.
Very blind, Ted. And Professor Liu, what would be your closing remarks?
Well, I think that the public, and this is the age of globalization, all over the world, including in this country, we have to organize, mobilize, and educate people as to why this is wrong and as to why our country has to take a different turn.
Outstanding. Thank you all.
You're welcome.
Capital punishment is perhaps the only irrevocable step in our judicial system. However you feel about sentencing people to death, we should all support a thorough accounting of the measures and fairness of that system. A system that will continue as is, whether we like it or not, until enough people generate enough will to make a change. For the professors, I'm CM Winters Palacio. Thank you for watching, and please coexist.